Secrets of Marie Curie's unseen labors. We all know Marie Curie as the icon who won 2 Nobel Prizes, a feat that makes her one of the all-time greats of science. But that's not the full story. In fact, it's not even close. Beyond the awards and the accolades lies a tale of grueling, unseen labor, of profound personal tragedy, and a chilling secret she carried to her grave, a secret so powerful and so persistent that her own notebooks are considered too dangerous to handle without protective gear even a century later. This is the story of the side of Marie Curie you've never been told, the story of the monumental cost of her genius and the radioactive legacy she left, locked in her very bones. The early struggles. To truly comprehend the scale of Marie Curie's achievements, you must first understand the world that was constructed to stop her. She wasn't born Marie Curie of Paris, the celebrated scientific celebrity. She was born Maria Salomea Skłodowska on November 7, 1867, in Warsaw, Poland. Her world was one of occupation and brutal oppression. At the time, Poland as an independent nation didn't exist. It had been carved up and was controlled by its powerful neighbors, with Warsaw under the thumb of the Russian Empire. This political reality was not a distant backdrop. It shaped every facet of her young life. Her family, on both her mother's and father's sides, was technically part of the Polish nobility, but they had lost their property and fortunes in patriotic uprisings aimed at restoring Polish independence. That spirit of defiance and national pride ran deep in her blood, but it came at an immense cost. Her father, Władysław Skłodowski, was a brilliant and dedicated teacher of mathematics and physics who instilled in his youngest daughter a profound love for science. However, his career was relentlessly sabotaged by his Russian supervisors, who punished him for his pro-Polish sentiments. He was denied promotions, his salary was cut, and eventually he lost his job, plunging the family into a life of constant financial and emotional struggle. The tragedy that defined her youth was not just political, it was deeply and painfully personal. When Maria was a young girl, her family was shattered by illness. Her oldest sister, Zofia, died of typhus. Just a few years later, her mother, Bronisława, a woman Maria deeply adored, succumbed to a long and agonizing battle with tuberculosis. This was an immense, 1-2 punch of grief that shook 10-year-old Maria's religious faith, but simultaneously hardened her resolve. The family was left fractured and adrift in a world that seemed cruelly determined to break them. Young Maria, who was affectionately known as Mania, was preternaturally bright. She possessed a stunning memory and an insatiable appetite for knowledge, a gift she nurtured with her father's guidance. She graduated from her secondary school at 15, ranked first in her class. But that is where her formal path slammed into a brick wall. In Russian-controlled Poland, higher education was a door bolted shut for women. The University of Warsaw was an institution for men only. For a mind as hungry and capable as Mania's, this wasn't just a rule, it was a cage. But in a city simmering with quiet, intellectual rebellion, a new, clandestine kind of school had begun to operate. The Uniwersytet Latający, or the Flying University. It was a secret network of illegal, underground classes held in private homes, constantly moving to dodge the Tsar's police. Here, in whispered lectures and with shared forbidden books, Mania and other young Polish women and men kept their intellectual flames alive, feeding their hunger for knowledge in direct defiance of their occupiers. It was an act of intellectual treason, and it was here that her true scientific training began. Still, a secret university could not grant a legitimate degree. The great formal universities of Europe, Paris, Zurich, Geneva, were the only true path forward. Her older sister Bronya shared this dream, and the two forged a pact born of incredible sacrifice and mutual devotion. Mania, just a teenager, would work as a governess and tutor, sending her meager earnings to Bronya so she could study medicine in Paris. The agreement was that once Bronya became a doctor and established herself, she would, in turn, support Mania's education. For the next 5 long years, Mania lived a life of intellectual exile and grueling work. She took positions with wealthy families, teaching their children, often in remote country estates where she felt isolated and lonely. It was often a humiliating existence. She was merely an employee, her brilliant mind confined to the nursery and the schoolroom. Yet, every spare moment was fiercely guarded for her own secret studies. At night, she devoured books on physics, chemistry, and mathematics, teaching herself in almost total isolation, with only her father's letters for guidance and encouragement. This was her first great unseen labor, years spent not in a laboratory, but in quiet, desperate self-education, all fueled by a distant dream and a sacred promise to her sister. In 1891, the summons she had been waiting for finally arrived. Bronya was now a doctor in Paris, and it was Mania's turn. At the age of 24, she packed her few belongings, leaving Poland for France. She enrolled at the Sorbonne, the vibrant heart of French intellectual life, and registered as Marie, the French version of her name. It was a small change, but symbolically enormous. Maria Skłodowska of occupied Warsaw stepped into the world as Marie Curie of Paris. Life in Paris presented a new kind of hardship. After a short stay with her sister, she insisted on having her own space, a tiny, unheated attic room in the Latin Quarter, closer to the university. It was a life of pure, monastic devotion to her studies. She survived on a diet of little more than bread, butter, and tea, and was so profoundly poor that she would sometimes faint from hunger. During the brutal Paris winters, she would pile every piece of clothing she owned onto her bed, seeking refuge from the biting cold. But for all the hardship, she was finally free. The library was open to her. The lectures were open to her. For the first time in her life, the world of knowledge was hers for the taking, and she pursued it with a ferocious determination, forged in years of oppression and struggle. This was the fire that created Marie Curie. Not fame and glory, but poverty, hunger, and an unstoppable will to learn. The grueling work of discovery. In 1894, Marie's trajectory changed forever. She had just earned her degree in physics, finishing first in her class, and was already working towards a second degree in mathematics. Her project at the time involved studying the magnetic properties of different types of steel, but the lab space she had was inadequate. A colleague, aware of her need for a proper laboratory, introduced her to a French physicist named Pierre Curie. He was the lab chief at the School of Physics and Chemistry of the city of Paris, and might have some space to spare. Pierre was already a respected scientist in his own right. Alongside his brother Jacques, he had discovered the phenomenon of piezoelectricity, the principle that certain crystals generate an electric charge under pressure. He was intense, brilliant, and like Marie, completely and utterly devoted to science. He was immediately captivated by this quiet, fiercely intelligent Polish woman who spoke of science with such passion. A romance born from a shared devotion to discovery began to blossom. Pierre proposed, but Marie, still clinging to the dream of returning to a free Poland, initially refused. Utterly smitten, Pierre declared that he would follow her to Poland and teach French if necessary. His profound devotion, coupled with the dawning realization that her scientific future was in Paris, not Warsaw, eventually won her over. They married in a simple, non-religious ceremony in July 1895. Marie wore a practical dark blue dress, which she would then use as a lab coat for years to come. Their partnership was far more than a marriage. It was a scientific force of nature. Initially, they worked on separate projects. But in 1896, the world of physics was set buzzing by a strange discovery made by Professor Henri Becquerel. He had found that uranium salts emitted mysterious, invisible rays that could pass through solid matter and expose a photographic plate. It was a strange, ghostly energy, and it fascinated Marie. Seeking a topic for her doctoral thesis, she decided to investigate these uranium rays. Pierre, recognizing the profound importance of her line of inquiry, secured her a place to work. It wasn't truly a laboratory, but rather a damp, crowded, glass-walled storeroom on the ground floor of the school. Here, using a highly sensitive electrometer, a device designed by Pierre and his brother to measure faint electrical charges, Marie began her meticulous work. She very quickly made a monumental discovery. The intensity of the radiation from a sample of uranium was not dependent on its chemical form, its temperature, or its exposure to light. It depended only on the amount of uranium present. This led her to a revolutionary hypothesis, a leap of intuition that would shatter a fundamental belief in physics. She theorized that the radiation was not the result of a chemical reaction between atoms, but was coming from the very heart of the atom itself. At a time when the atom was widely considered to be the solid, indivisible, fundamental building block of the universe, this was scientific heresy. It was the first suggestion that atoms possessed an internal structure and could spontaneously disintegrate. In her notes, she coined a new word for this startling phenomenon: radioactivity. Her scientific curiosity pushed her further. If radioactivity was an atomic property, could other elements be radioactive as well? While systematically testing different minerals, her electrometer produced a shocking reading. 2 uranium ores, pitchblende and chalcolite, were dramatically more radioactive than pure uranium itself. The conclusion was inescapable, even if it sounded insane. These minerals must contain a new, undiscovered element that was far, far more radioactive than uranium. When she presented her findings to Pierre, he immediately grasped the magnitude of her discovery. He put his own acclaimed research on crystals aside and joined her in her quest. And so began the most exhausting, physically punishing, and unseen labor of their lives. To prove the existence of these new elements, they had to isolate them. The immense challenge was that pitchblende is a complex cocktail of nearly 30 different elements, and the new, highly radioactive ones were present in infinitesimally small quantities. The school's director offered them a new workspace, an abandoned shed across the courtyard. Marie herself described it best. It was a wooden shed with a leaky glass roof that didn't keep the rain out, a dirt floor, and no proper ventilation. It contained some old pined tables, a dysfunctional cast-iron stove, and a blackboard. There were no fume hoods to vent the poisonous gases produced by their chemical treatments. so they were forced to perform that dangerous work outside in the courtyard. This dilapidated shack, which had once served as a dissecting room for a medical school, would become the legendary birthplace of two new elements on the periodic table. A mining company in Austria, which considered the pitchblende ore to be useless waste after extracting uranium, donated a ton of it. Soon, piles of the dark, heavy ore were stacked outside their new lab. The work was physically crushing. For 4 long years, Marie and Pierre toiled in this miserable shed. Marie, often in her dust-covered, acid-stained smock, was less like a scientist and more like a factory worker, spending entire days stirring huge, bubbling cauldrons of pitchblende with a heavy iron rod almost as tall as she was. Their process was a colossal feat of fractional crystallization. They had to grind, dissolve, filter, and purify the material over and over and over again, using the sensitive electrometer at each step to track which chemical fraction contained the elusive radioactivity. It was a painstaking process of elimination, repeated thousands of times. In July 1898, they announced the discovery of one of the new elements. It was intensely radioactive, and in a tribute to her lost homeland, Marie named it polonium. But they were not finished. The remaining liquid from the separation was still tremendously radioactive. By December of that same year, they announced the discovery of a second element, one that was thousands of times more radioactive still. They called it radium, from the Latin word for ray. Announcing these discoveries was one thing. Proving their existence to a skeptical scientific world was another. To do that, they needed a pure sample of radium, and they needed to determine its atomic weight. It took Marie another 4 years of relentless, solitary work after the initial discoveries to finally isolate just 1/10 of a gram of pure radium chloride in 1902. All this time, they were working in a state of blissful, tragic ignorance. They had no idea that the very substance they were discovering was silently and relentlessly attacking their bodies. They handled the highly radioactive materials with their bare hands. Marie was known to carry test tubes of glowing radium salts in her pockets, enjoying the faint, fairy lights. The air in their unventilated shed was thick with radioactive dust and radon gas. They were constantly sick, bone-tired, and plagued with aches and pains, but they attributed their ailments to simple overwork and exhaustion. In reality, they were suffering from the early stages of radiation sickness. Their unseen labor was not just the physical toil of their work, but the invisible price they were paying with their very health. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Marie Curie's untold story, press the subscribe button and do not forget to like. By 1903, the name Curie was echoing through the scientific communities of the world. Their revolutionary work on radioactivity had turned the field of physics on its head. That December, the ultimate recognition arrived, a Nobel Prize in physics. But even this supreme triumph was nearly tainted by the pervasive sexism of the era. The French Academy of Sciences, in its nomination to the Nobel Committee, initially proposed honoring only Henri Becquerel and Pierre Curie. Marie, whose doctoral thesis had initiated the entire line of research and whose relentless work had isolated the new elements, was on the verge of being erased from her own discovery. It was Pierre who decisively stopped this injustice. Furious at the omission, he wrote to the Nobel Committee, making his position unequivocally clear. "I very much wish to be considered together with Madame Curie." His message was simple and powerful. Her contribution was not secondary, but essential. His intervention worked. Marie Curie became the first woman in history to win a Nobel Prize. Suddenly, they were thrust into the blinding spotlight of global fame. The press, utterly fascinated by this romantic husband and wife team unlocking the secrets of the atom, turned them into international celebrities. They were inundated with letters, requests for interviews, and social invitations. For the intensely private Curies, this unwanted attention was a form of torture. Pierre complained that their lives were being completely ruined by honors and fame. All they truly wanted was to be left alone in their lab. Their health was steadily deteriorating. Both suffered from chronic pain, fatigue, and mysterious illnesses. Pierre, in particular, was often so racked with pain in his legs that he could barely stand. But a far more horrific tragedy was about to unfold. On April 19, 1906, a rainy day in Paris, Pierre was walking across the busy Rue Dauphine. Distracted, his mind likely lost in scientific thought, he slipped on the wet pavement and fell directly into the path of a heavy, horse-drawn wagon. A massive wheel crushed his skull, killing him instantly. He was only 46 years old. Marie was utterly shattered. The love of her life, her scientific soulmate, was gone in a brutal, senseless instant. In her diary, she poured out her unbearable anguish, writing directly to the man she had lost. Crushed by the blow, I did not feel able to face the future. I could not forget, however, what my husband used to say, that even deprived of him, I ought to continue my work. The French government offered her a state pension, the standard provision for the widow of a great man. Marie refused it, insisting with quiet dignity that she was perfectly capable of supporting herself and her two young daughters, Irene and Eve. Then the Sorbonne made an unprecedented offer. They invited her to take over Pierre's professorship, a position that had been created for him. On November 5, 1906, she walked into the lecture hall, which was packed with students, press, and curious onlookers. She began her lecture at the exact sentence where Pierre's last one had ended. Marie Curie thus became the first female professor in the Sorbonne's 750-year history, a moment of quiet, steely triumph born from the deepest tragedy. She threw herself into her work with a renewed, almost desperate passion, now driven by a new goal: to build a world-class laboratory in Pierre's memory, the kind of state-of-the-art institute he had never had. But the world was not finished being cruel to her. 4 years after Pierre's death, Marie, now a 43-year-old widow, found intellectual companionship and emotional comfort with a fellow physicist, Paul Langevin. He was a brilliant man, one of Pierre's former students, but he was trapped in a desperately unhappy marriage. Their close friendship deepened into a love affair in 1910. It was a private matter that exploded into a vicious public scandal. Langevin's wife discovered letters between the two lovers and leaked them to the xenophobic and misogynistic tabloid press. The reaction was wild and brutal. The papers branded Marie a foreign Jewish home-wrecker. The fact that she was an atheist, not Jewish, was irrelevant to the narrative. She was the outsider, the Polish interloper who had stolen a French husband from his wife and children. Angry mobs gathered outside her home, terrorizing her and her daughters. The scandal erupted in November 1911, at the precise moment the Nobel Committee in Sweden announced she was being awarded a second prize, this time in chemistry, for the isolation of pure radium and polonium. It was an unparalleled achievement. She was the first person ever to win 2 Nobel Prizes. To this day, she remains the only person to have won in 2 different scientific fields. But the scandal threatened to destroy everything. A prominent member of the Swedish Academy of Sciences wrote to her, suggesting she should not come to Stockholm to accept the prize, implying her moral character made her unworthy. Her response was a masterpiece of dignity and defiance. She wrote back that she would be there, stating firmly that the prize was for her scientific work, and there is no relation between her scientific work and the facts of her private life. She went to Stockholm and accepted her prize, but the entire ordeal took a devastating toll. Upon her return to France, she collapsed from a severe kidney ailment and debilitating depression and had to be hospitalized. For over a year, she was unable to work. It was another one of her great unseen labors, battling not just the elements in her laboratory, but the viciousness of a public that celebrated her genius one moment and condemned her humanity the next. The unseen war hero. When the cannons of August 1914 plunged Europe into the Great War, much of civilian science ground to a halt. For Marie Curie, whose new Radium Institute in Paris was finally complete, it seemed her life's work would be put on hold once more. But as the German army marched on Paris, Marie saw a new, urgent mission emerge from the chaos. Her first act was one of scientific preservation. She had in her possession the entire French supply of radium. The single gram she had painstakingly isolated. It was priceless. She packed the radium into a heavy, lead-lined box, and like any other refugee, took a train to Bordeaux, where she deposited it in a bank vault. But her mission was not to escape. It was to serve. As soon as the radium was secure, she returned directly to the unfolding crisis in Paris. She understood something that military commanders did not yet grasp. The brutal new trench warfare was producing horrific injuries from bullets and shrapnel. Surgeons working near the front lines were often operating blind, which led to botched surgeries, rampant infections, and countless needless amputations. Marie knew that X-rays could change everything, giving doctors the ability to see inside the body before making an incision. The problem was that X-ray machines were large, delicate pieces of equipment, confined to city hospitals far from the battlefields. Marie conceived of a revolutionary idea. If the wounded soldiers couldn't get to the X-rays had to go to the soldiers. She envisioned mobile radiology units built into cars that could be driven directly to the front lines. This was not her field of expertise. She had lectured on the physics of X-rays, but had never worked with them in a practical or medical setting. That didn't deter her. This 47-year-old, 2-time Nobel laureate, dove into a frantic, self-directed course of study. She taught herself radiology, cramming knowledge of anatomy and how to operate X-ray equipment. She also learned basic auto mechanics and how to drive a car. Armed with this new knowledge, she became a relentless force of nature. Appointed director of the Red Cross Radiology Service, she transformed into a tireless fundraiser, convincing wealthy Parisians to donate cars and money. She enlisted body shops to convert the vehicles into vans and begged manufacturers to supply the necessary equipment. By late October 1914, just months after the war's outbreak, the first mobile unit was ready. It was a marvel of battlefield ingenuity, containing an X-ray machine, a dark room for developing plates, and a dynamo powered by the car's engine to generate the required electricity. French soldiers quickly gave them an affectionate nickname, Les Petites Curies, the Little Curies. Marie's first assistant in that dangerous venture was her own daughter, Irene, who was only 17 years old. Together, mother and daughter took the first Petite Curie to the front during the brutal Battle of the Marne. In chaotic makeshift hospitals just miles from the fighting, Marie and Irene worked tirelessly, X-raying wounded soldiers so that surgeons could precisely locate shrapnel and bullets, saving countless lives and limbs. But one unit wasn't enough. Marie realized she needed a fleet, and that fleet needed trained staff. So she did what she had always done. She taught. She established training courses in radiology, teaching over 150 women how to operate X-ray machines, understand basic anatomy, and assist surgeons. By the end of the war, there were about 20 mobile units and hundreds of fixed X-ray installations in field hospitals across France, most of which existed because Marie refused to accept that nothing could be done. Her work was incredibly dangerous. She was constantly on the move, often driving the vehicles herself to the volatile front lines. She was exposed not only to the daily horrors of war, but also to intense, repeated doses of X-ray radiation, day after day, with almost no protection. This was yet another massive dose of radiation, added to the invisible debt that had been accumulating in her body for decades. By the end of the war, it is estimated that over 1 million wounded soldiers were treated with her X-ray units. Countless lives were saved, and countless limbs were spared from amputation, all because of her vision, her practical genius, and her profound courage. Yet for all of this, for her years of selfless and dangerous work, Marie Curie never received any formal recognition from the French government. She had tried to donate her gold Nobel medals to the war effort, but the National Bank refused to accept them. Instead, she used her prize money to buy war bonds. Her contribution to France was immeasurable, but it remained another one of her great and unheralded, unseen labors. The Radioactive Legacy. After the war, Marie Curie returned to her Radium Institute. She was now a global icon, an unparalleled symbol of scientific genius and female intellectual power. She dedicated the rest of her life to transforming her institute into a world-leading center for the study of radioactivity, particularly its applications in medicine. The discovery that radium could kill diseased cells faster than healthy ones was now the foundation of a revolutionary new field for fighting cancer, radiotherapy. But the elemental fire she had unleashed upon the world was slowly and inexorably consuming her from within. The invisible enemy she had lived and worked with for decades was finally making its devastating presence known. Her health began a steep and irreversible decline. The first clear sign was in her eyes. She was diagnosed with cataracts, and her vision grew so clouded that she was forced to write her laboratory notes in enormous letters. Today, it's known that cataracts are a common consequence of radiation exposure. She endured 4 painful eye surgeries, all while trying to hide the true nature of her illness, terrified that it would tarnish the reputation of her beloved radium. Her body, once strong enough to haul sacks of ore and stir vats of chemicals, was systematically failing her. She was plagued by constant fatigue, a persistent low-grade fever, and her hands, the very hands that had held, sifted, and crystallized so much radium, were scarred, cracked, and burned from radiation exposure. Still, She seemed to refuse to connect her deteriorating health to the true cause. She and other researchers of her generation simply didn't understand the profound, long-term cellular damage that radiation could inflict. While she did eventually advocate for safety measures like lead screens and regular blood tests for workers at her institute, she seemed to believe these precautions were for industrial laborers, not for careful scientists like herself. In the spring of 1934, her strength finally gave out. She went home sick from her lab one day and never returned. Her doctors were mystified. Finally, a specialist at the Saint-Célimos Sanatorium in Passy, France, gave her condition a name: aplastic pernicious anemia. It is a rare disease where the bone marrow, the body's factory for life-giving blood cells, simply stops working. The director of the sanatorium where she spent her final days wrote a chilling and definitive diagnosis. The bone marrow did not react, probably because it had been injured by a long accumulation of radiation. The decades of cumulative exposure, from the pitchblende in the shed, from the glowing radium she sometimes kept by her bedside as a nightlight, and from the unshielded X-rays on the battlefields, had delivered their final, fatal blow. The element she had given to the world had, in turn, taken her life. Marie Curie died on July 4th, 1934, at the age of 66. But her radioactive legacy didn't die with her. It lives on, tangible and perilous. At France's National Library in Paris, her research notebooks from the 1890s are stored in lead-lined boxes. More than a century after she filled their pages with her revolutionary thoughts, these notebooks remain so radioactive that any researcher wishing to view them must wear protective clothing and sign a waiver of liability. The radium-226 that contaminated the paper from her hands has a half-life of 1,600 years. Her very thoughts are sealed away by the ghost of the element she discovered. It wasn't just her notebooks, her furniture, her clothes, even her cookbooks remain radioactive to this day. When her body was exhumed in 1995 to be moved to the Pantheon, France's national mausoleum, concerns about lingering radiation were so high that her coffin was lined with nearly an inch of lead. She and Pierre were reinterred in lead-lined coffins, a final barrier against the secret they carried in their very bones. Marie Curie became the first woman to be entombed in the Pantheon on her own merits. A national hero whose remains are still, quite literally, radiating the power of her life's work. Marie Curie's life was a profound study in paradox. She was a revolutionary who fundamentally changed our understanding of the universe. Yet she conducted her most important work in a leaky, dilapidated shed. She was a double Nobel laureate who was dragged through the mud by the press as an immoral foreigner. She was a selfless humanitarian who helped save an estimated 1 million soldiers, but received no official thanks for her service from her adopted country. She gave the world a new weapon against cancer, a tool born from the very substance that caused her own. Her story is not one of simple, clean scientific triumph. The truth is far more complex, far more difficult, and far more human. It is a story of ferocious determination in the face of impossible odds, of a young woman from an occupied country who dared to dream of science when the world told her no. It is a story of immense, back-breaking, unseen labor, of stirring, boiling vats of mineral ore day after day for years on end. And it is a story of profound personal tragedy, of love lost in an instant, and of enduring public scorn. Her legacy isn't just the discovery of polonium and radium. It's in the 96th element, on the periodic table, curium, named in honor of her and Pierre. It's in the radiotherapy treatments that use the principles she discovered to save millions of lives. And it's in those lead-lined boxes in Paris, a stark and enduring reminder of the incredible cost of her discoveries. Her notebooks will remain dangerously radioactive for another 1,500 years and more, a silent, powerful testament to the woman who handled fire itself to give the world a new and brilliant light. She once said, "Nothing in life is to be feared. It is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more, so that we may fear less." Marie Curie dedicated her life to the cause of understanding. In doing so, she knowingly and unknowingly gave her life. She was more than an iconic scientist. She was a pioneer, a warrior, and ultimately a martyr to her own discovery. And her unseen labors, both in the shed and in her heart, were the true source of her radiant and everlasting legacy. If you found this journey into the unseen world of Marie Curie compelling, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more deep dives into history's most fascinating figures. Let us know in the comments what aspect of Marie Curie's life you find most inspiring. Till next time, stay curious.